for those who don't know, served as a youth and children's pastor for the better part of 12 years before coming here. So if you're wondering what makes me so odd and weird, that is exactly it. Like, I think it clicked in at about year 3 probably, and it just went downhill from there. And then I got trapped in some endless cycle and tried to escape it and couldn't do it. And anyway, that's what does it. But here's the thing that actually I loved about doing youth and children's ministry for all those years, and something that I'll continue to hold dear. I mean, number one, there were the stories that came from the children in children's church, like about parents. Like, that was my favorite. I knew more about the parents than the lead pastor of the church knew about the parents. Like, I just get more information than you ever wanted to get in those contexts. It was as if I was a doctor and they're just spilling their beans to me. Like, it was bad. But there was this other part after, and this happened more with teenagers than it did with children, but after like a weekend away where God had really done something in their lives, they'd come back and have stories to share about those moments, things that they had either given up or had let go of in their life. You know, I'm going to start this school year out and I ain't going to cuss no more, or I ain't going to talk back to my parents. You know, like all these things that students will say in these moments, and parents are like, that's great. You know, you get your kid back from these events and you're like, how long is this going to last? Like, let me just start my timer now, right? But these are these great moments. Now, on the flip side of it, they would give up certain things, but they would also take on certain things. And this was pretty much 100% of the time. Come back and be like, I want to be a better Christian this year in school. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, I'm going to read my Bible more, and I'm going to pray more, right? I mean, those are always the two things. No one says, I'm going to fast for like the rest of the week. No one ever said, no teenage boy ever said, I just want to give up food for the remainder of the week, because that's what Jesus did for 40 days. Like, that doesn't happen. But we do stick with the praying and the fasting. And I've noticed this over and over again. There are certain things, and if we're adults, we can kind of agree with this. There are certain things that we do, religious practices that we engage in, things that we take up, that say these make us really good religious people. Don't they? I mean, for us, it could be reading the Bible. It could be praying every day, praying over meals before we all indulge. Like, it could be fasting for some of us. It's been a while since I've fasted, but, you know, like, it could be. We could fast. Coming to church is a big one. Serving in the community. I mean, some of these things are rituals that we do. The songs we sing on a Sunday. The times out of the month where we participate in the sacraments like the Lord's Supper. These are all rituals that we do. And when we do them, we feel like I'm being a better Christian. I'm getting involved, and this is how I'm kind of showing that I'm a good religious person. And prayer probably is the biggest one. Now today I'm going to harp a little bit on prayer, but really I'm going to talk about religious things in general, religious rituals in general that make the average Christian the average Christian. And when it comes to prayer, when it comes to spiritual disciplines, for that matter, Jesus knew that all of these things had their place. They had a proper place. But what may surprise you as you read Scripture is that for all of these things, they weren't first place. Prayer was not first place in Jesus' world. It didn't ever take that spot. Prayer didn't get the first place in Jesus' world. Jesus put prayer, He put every other spiritual discipline in their place, but He put them in second place. Behind you, behind me. They have their place. They have their place in our lives as believers. They have their place in our community, but they always take the second place behind us, behind people. And this may definitely seem odd. It may be odd to say. In fact, it is odd to say because the average Christian doesn't believe that way, doesn't act that way, right? The average Christian believes and acts as if those practices are the number one thing that we can do to be good Christians. But remember, Jesus is not your average Christian leader. He's different, and He calls us to be different. He's so much better than average, and He wants us to be so much better than just average. Now, this is not to say that prayer didn't have its place. It's not to say that fasting and going to church and worship, like all of those things, they have their place. They have a place. They just need, in our minds today, to be sealed in their proper place. And here's why this is so important, and you know this, I don't have to go through this, but let me just kind of highlight it and just remind us all of this. When prayer takes first place, it begins flexing its muscles at the expense of mercy. When acts of prayer, when the ritual of prayer moves into the first place in our life, when religious rituals in general move into first place in our life, they often do so at the expense of mercy. Now, you can take just kind of a freshman level look at history and see that this is true. Whenever any of these rituals moved into their first place, they did so at the expense of mercy. Right? At the expense of mercy, the infidels were baptized during the Crusades because that was the ritual that they needed to participate in order to secure their rights in heaven. So we will baptize them and chop their heads off right afterwards. It's done at the expense of mercy. And this isn't just a historical problem. In fact, I found a prayer this week. I'm not going to tell you who the prayer was for, but it was for a president. And I just want you to listen to the words of this prayer. It says, "Let his days be few, and let another take his office." And here's where it gets good. I thought that was good. "Let his children be fatherless, and his wife a widow. Let his children be continually vagabonds and beg. Let them seek their bread also out of their desolate places. Let the extortioner catch all that he hath, and let the stranger spoil his labor. Let there be none to extend mercy unto him. Neither let there be any favor to his fatherless children. Let his posterity be cut off, and in the generation following, let their name be blotted out." You see, when prayer takes first place, when rituals of religion take first place, they often do so at the expense of mercy. And that's why when you read the Gospels, you are never going to find a place where Jesus submits people at the expense of rituals. Jesus was in a constant battle over the position and placement of religious things like prayer and fasting and going to church or honoring the Sabbath. And there's two things that religious people and Jesus got in common. Two things. In all of the stories, we always see that Jesus and the religious people thought that the law of Moses and the practices of religion were important. In fact, if you go back later today or sometime this week and read Matthew chapter 5, you're going to see Jesus saying, "Don't assume that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. I didn't do that." He says, "I didn't come to destroy the law and the prophets. In fact, on the opposite end of the thing, I came so that they might be fulfilled." Like there's not one little dot in the law, one little mark in the law that will go away before it is all fulfilled. I came so that the entire law would be fulfilled. So don't misunderstand me, Jesus says. I think that there should be priority placed on the law and the prophets and the religious practices that are out there. And Jesus and the religious leaders, not only did they agree about this, they also thought that people were important. Everyone would agree, yes, people are important. And while they both held on to these values, they both argued over how to prioritize these values. They didn't argue over if these things were important, but over which of these things were most important. What they didn't agree on is where to place the emphasis when it came to people and practices of prayer. And that's what we don't often agree on. If you want to see the difference between an average church and a not-so-average church, it comes down to this. Where will we place the emphasis when it comes to religious things versus people? But since Jesus wasn't your average leader, Jesus constantly prioritized people over religious rituals. Now, this completely confused all the religious leaders who were out there. And on the one hand, Jesus is saying, look, I'm not going to let any of the law pass away. I'm going to fulfill it. We're going to uphold it. And on the other hand, it seems like he's completely disregarding the law at certain points in time for the sake of people. And that's exactly what he did in Mark's gospel. Now, this morning, Jenna only read a final portion of Mark chapter 2. But the entire chapter, if you'll go back and read Mark chapter 2, you'll see this over and over again. Jesus is in a battle in Mark 2 with the religious people over religious things versus people. Starts out early on in the gospel where there's a paralyzed man that's brought before Jesus. And Jesus does what is the human thing to do, and he heals him. But in the context of that, he says, your sins are forgiven. And at this point, of course, this is just blowing the minds of the religious people. They're like, no, that's for God, that's for God, that's for God. We don't do that. And Jesus says, no, it's not. I am the Son of God, right? And he says, just so you know that the Son of Man has the authority to forgive sins on earth, what do you think is harder? For me to say those words, your sins are forgiven, for me to tell him to get up and walk? And they're like, well, obviously, to get up and walk. And he's like, okay, good. Get up and walk. And the dude gets up and walks. His eyes turn towards the people more than they do the religious history and practices that are there. And the story goes on. He doesn't just stop with that. He goes on to a dinner feast, and he decides not to go and eat with the Pharisees and the religious leaders. He decides to go eat with sinners and tax collectors. And this blows their mind because they're like, you don't eat with sinners and that doesn't line up with our religious practices. And the story goes on. And the religious leaders come to him again another day, and they're like, look, all of John's disciples, all the disciples of the Pharisees, all these people over here, they fast. You got a bunch of slackers out there, right? Like, you guys don't fast. You're gluttons. You never fast. Why do you not fast and uphold the religious rituals? And Jesus again responds with favor of the people. And then when we get to the part that we read aloud today, the last part, the part that deals with Sabbath, when we get into that part, the Sabbath rituals are in question. And one day, Jesus is walking down the road on a Sabbath. And as he's walking down the road, there's these religious leaders around him once again. They're gathering around, and his disciples are there, and they're all walking past a wheat field. Now, along the way, the disciples are hungry. Maybe they have decided to finally fast. I don't know. But they're hungry at this point, right? And as they reach out, they just kind of pop a snack. Like, I don't know if you've ever done that, but like you're going down the road or going through the grocery store. We wouldn't go through a field, right? But you ever get in those moments where you're just getting hangry and the kids are loud and you're like, I can't handle this. You just rip open the bag of popcorn and just like chow down in the store. You don't do that, do you? It's just me. It's okay. It's fine. I mean, there's these moments where we just get so much, we just got to grab something and put it in our mouth. And I kind of imagine the disciples at this point. They're just walking down the road and they just reach out and they grab it. And they pop it in. And immediately the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders who were there, they're like, no, what are you doing? This is crazy. You can't break the Sabbath law on the Sabbath. Like, why would you do that? They're harvesting. Jesus is like, they're snacking. That's not harvesting, right? But the religious leaders insist. And here's where we pick up our story. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? And what Jesus does in his unique Jesus way is he throws back at them a piece of the law and the prophets that they overlooked. He just tosses it right back out at them. Just gives it to him. He goes on. He tells them the story of David. This story where David, now, there are three people you don't want to touch in the Old Testament, the law and the prophets, right? There's Moses. Don't touch Moses. Like, that's not a good idea. Don't ever challenge Moses. Don't challenge Abraham, and don't challenge David. Like, these are the three. And so immediately Jesus goes to one of the three. He's like, you know what, that dude you like so much from the law and the prophets, David? You remember this story? You probably remember it. Of course you remember it. You love the law and the prophets. I'm not the only one who loves them. Surely you remember this. And they're like, well, what story? What story? And he's like, the story where David's men were hungry. And there was some bread, and it was set aside in the temple, and only the priests could eat it. You know what David did that day? Because he had hungry people, he fed them. And everybody's like, George, is that right? Like, I don't know if I missed that day or... Like, they're trying to, they're like stumped immediately, just trying to figure out whether or not this is true. And Jesus goes on. He says, one of the most powerful things that would mess up every religious ritual that they had. He says, the Sabbath was made for man, or for humanity, not man for the Sabbath. He says, you got it backwards, and the people are like, Jesus, what kind of voodoo are you playing on us now, right? Like, what is this? The man was made for the Sabbath, Sabbath not for man. I don't understand what you're talking. He said, no, you've got it all backwards. You're assuming that this ritual is something that God held on to and just sort of poured it out one day and needed human beings to tinker around with it. But the truth is that God created human beings first and placed priority there. And then he created certain laws and guidelines for which we can live. And he did that because he loved us, because he loved the human being. He's saying the Sabbath was made for the betterment of man, not man to just abide by the Sabbath. Jesus is saying, you and I don't have a Father in heaven who's like this incredible, who has an incredible memory bank of laws, right? God's not walking around the halls of heaven looking, going, that's a really fine set of laws. Let me create some people, and I'll pull those off the shelf and see if we can start exercising with them. That's not what he did, right? Jesus had the people. He created the people. He set them forth, and then he created the laws to help people live better, to love better, to act more mercifully to one another. Let me put it this way. For the parents in the room. Parents, you don't have children so that there will be someone to pick up the toys, right? I mean, that's not what this is all about. You're not creating these new little life forms and putting them in your house and be like, oh, one day you'll be able to do the dishes. Like, this is although that is something that I fantasize about, just to be honest. But, I mean, It's true, though, right? We laugh about this, but it's true. If you grew up in a home where your parents were all about the law, they were all about the rules, and a rule is a rule is a rule is a rule, it was a very orderly house, no doubt. But the truth is probably this: you couldn't wait to get out of that house, right? Your parents sometimes are counting down the days till they're 18, but you are certainly counting them down. You got like a clock or a calendar behind the door. You're just marking them off like, oh, thank God I'm one day out of this, you know? Because this is such order. They're so order. However, here's the deal. And you may not like buy into this at first, but just kind of lean in and listen to me. Great parents, really great parents know how to make rules. They know how to create rules and enforce rules. But the best of parents know how to break rules. They know when it's appropriate to break their own rules. Like, for instance, you got a rule every single day, Monday through Friday. Your child is going to get up and go to school, right? That's a rule. They will do it. They will go to school. But the best parents know, for the sake of the child, when it comes, that you will say, based on your circumstances, based on you don't have to go to school today. It may be sickness. It may be something that you've gone through. But the best parents in the room know, whenever it comes to the rules, they will break them every time in favor of the you if it's better for the you. Now, this cuts both ways, right? I mean, it's not just the whole, I am out of school today. Like, you know, you might tell your child, hey, you can go to your friend's house. This is 2 weeks before the event happens. You're like, yeah, you can go there. That's not a problem at all. I have no problem with you going. And then a week later, you're talking to somebody at work, and you're like, I heard about this party that's going to happen over in so-and-so's house. You're like, whoa, what? What party is this? You were like halfway listening until they said the name. And you're like, wait, come back to me. And you're like, they're doing what there? Yeah, I mean, it's supposed to be some big thing. I don't know. I'm a little worried about it. I wouldn't let my kids go. You're like, well, I told my kid he could go. Like, I promised, right? But the best parent will not allow, even though we tell our kids, don't ever break a promise, even though we tell them that, the best parents in the room, they'll break the rule, won't they? You'll come back and you'll have a hard conversation with your son or your daughter, and you'll be like, I know I told you could go. Yes, you did. I know I promised that you could go. Yes, you did. I'm going to have to break that promise. And why am I going to break that promise? Because you are more important than the rule that I established. You are more important to me. Your safety, your well-being, your future is more important to me than the rule that I've established. And we know that really great parents fall into this category. You see, this new arrangement, and here's where it gets kind of iffy with religious people, because this new arrangement makes everybody who's religious like really nervous. And it should make us nervous. Because Jesus says, I've not come to put all your religious rituals and practices in first place. I've come to put them in their place, but it's not first. And how is that? How can he do that? How's he kind of operate this way? Let me wrap this up for you. Jesus does it because he knows the entire law. And one day the religious people come to him and they say, tell us what the best, the greatest, the most important law is. And you and I know this story. Jesus responds to them and he says, here it is. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And again, just like last week, all the religious leaders are going, yep, that's it. That's exactly right. Why are you not doing that, right? And Jesus says, don't interrupt me. Please just stop. He says, and the second is like it. And they're like, wait a minute. No, there's no second. We just asked you for the greatest. He says, no, the second. It's a continuation of the first. It goes part and parcel with it. You can't separate it off. The second is like it. Is another way of saying this in the Greek is equal to it. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, this is different, isn't it? Because loving the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, that right there, that can be an internal thing. You don't have to display that to anybody, which is what the religious people were hoping for. They had this imaginary commandment out there where they could just say they're loving the Lord their God, but there's no physical action. But Jesus takes it a step further and says, look, if there is indeed love for the Lord your God, with all your mind, heart, soul, and strength, there will be external action. Love your neighbor as yourself. And here's why he can say this as the most important and say all the crazy things he does afterwards. He finishes that sentence off and says, love your neighbor as yourself, for all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Jesus knows the law and the prophets. He knows the laws and the rituals that the law requires, and he loves them. You never find Jesus bad-mouthing them. You never find Jesus saying, no, you shouldn't participate in them. But Jesus knows and loves people too. And because Jesus knows the proper place of these two things, Jesus knows that people take priority over practices every single time. If we look back at the lives and teachings of Jesus, we'll never find an occasion where Jesus preferred the rituals and the practices over religion. You're not going to find it. He's not going to prefer them to the neglect of people. He never leveraged his theological perspectives to mistreat other people. He didn't do it. He never gave us the power to say, well, you know, I'd really like to be there for you. I'd like to help you out, but I can't because this is what I believe. He never gave us the right to say, I'd really like to help you and walk along beside you in this journey, but I can't because the Bible says this. I'd really like to go there with you, but I can't because I'm a Christian. Like Jesus never allowed his love for rituals and practices of religion to get in the way of real ministry and real transformation of other people's lives. Jesus knew what the law said. He knew it better than any of us in this room, and obviously better than the Pharisees who were challenging him. He knew what the rituals were. He knew what was expected, but he also knew who the law was created for. People. He knew who it was in service to. And there are occasions where you and I know what we value. You and I get it. We hold certain things that we value. We hold certain things that we believe. We know what the Bible says about certain things. We know what's expected for us. But there are people. There are situations where there's a person standing in front of you, and you know what you believe. But there's a person. When the person is there, the person introduces tensions with our rituals. And it's in those moments that Jesus says, if you want to resolve the tension, you have to lean towards the people. If you want to resolve, and you may never fully resolve it, that's what tension is, right? But if you're going to lean one way or the other, if you're going to be anchored in one way or the other, anchor with the people, not with the religion, not with the ritual. That person can cause us to ask all kinds of questions, but we know, and the questions might be something like this. We know what we believe. We know what the ritualistic response is. But what should we do with the people? And when Jesus kept this in mind, he always kept his priorities straight. He always leaned one way over the other. And if we're going to be a church that follows after this not-so-average leader, if we're going to be a church that's not so average, then we have to say this. This has to be our heart's cry. When it comes to our religious practices and rituals, you are more important than my view. You. If you're new here to Salem, I want to say this to you. We have a lot of religious rituals and practices that we participate in. We have churchy language that we use, and some of you may be here and be like, I don't understand what that is, but I want you to know, you are more important than our views. We'll continue to value our practices, and we'll talk to you about our practices, and we'll participate and invite you to participate. But you are more important than our view. I have a view. I have a religious practice. I have ways in which I ritualistically engage with God all the time, and that's okay. But if I'm going to follow Jesus, I have to say you are more important than my view. When it comes to prayer and fasting and worship and singing and preaching and all of our religious rituals, we have to put them in their proper place. It's not first place. And I know when I say it out loud, even as I just said it now, I'm like, that seems so weird. It seems so radical to say it's not first place. But we know this is true. No one ever says, I am so glad Jesus died so that I can read my Bible better. Right? No one ever says, I'm so glad that Jesus died so that I could pray better, that I could sing louder, that I could go to church more. Like, no one ever says that. Jesus didn't die so that we could observe our rituals. Jesus didn't die for precepts and principles. He died for people. Jesus didn't die for the law. He died for lawbreakers. Jesus didn't die for a set of rules. He died for rule breakers. He didn't die even for sin. He died for sinners. He didn't die for your view, or my view, or anybody else's view. He died for you. Jesus came to put all of our religious practices and perspectives in their place. And their place is behind you. Their place is behind me. Their place is behind my wife and my son. He put those things in their place. He put them behind the person to your left and right, the person to your left and right physically, the person to your left and right ideologically, politically, even religiously. He died to put those things in their place behind us. And if you and I can grab on to that single principle, if we can rightly position our rituals and practices, then I guarantee you, we will no longer be your average church.